Whenever I think about AI, I remember my childhood in Ghana. Man, those were the days. I mean, we could build bed perches, we could whip up the swankiest cars from milk tins and beverage cans. And some of our greatest heroes, some of our greatest superheroes actually, were from the local auto garages. People like Bra Kofi, who could whip up carbide fireworks from pure scrap, heat and intuition, knock together magical gizmos. And then it makes me sad because today, the first social intelligence a young child growing up in Ghana, like Accra, encounters is likely to be on the screen. They're very unlikely to meet Bra Kofi. In my 20 years of working at the intersection of technology, policy, and development, I have come to the conclusion that this is the biggest issue in AI, which is to say that the more intelligence we put in machines, the less we seem to co-create together. But before I walk you through my explanation, a few numbers. Those of you who follow this knows Goldman Sachs predicts about $7.6 trillion of capital expense by AI companies and frontier labs in the next couple of years. $7.6 trillion. In fact, those of you who have been following the news know that SpaceX is projecting revenue that is 40% of all the corporate revenues in the world. 40%. Now, my argument is that these guys are not betting on the kind of use cases most of you are familiar with. The kind of humdrum task of summarizing notes, that kind of thing. No, that's not what they can be betting on. It doesn't add up. The numbers don't add up. They are betting on something that I call civilizational acceleration. Essentially, the fastest, most unprecedented shift in human society, in our civilization historically. Think of interplanetary travel, infinite energy storage potential, precision medicine, that kind of thing. That's what they are betting on. The question is that to do this, AI has to become smarter, damn smarter, way faster. Which brings us to the question, how does AI get smarter? How does machine intelligence grow? I think it's in three ways. Depth, range, and amplification. And I'll explain each in turn. Primarily, in respect of depth, AI becomes intelligent by feeding on the civilization. I know, but just allow me to give you a thought experiment, which will explain what I mean by feeding on the civilization. Suppose any of you were to get a time machine and to go back, far back in history, to ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. Think of that. And then you went all over the place and you hoovered up all the intelligence of that period. The cuneiform, the hieroglyphics, just hoovered it all up. Use the same LLMs we have today, same technical architecture, transformer, all that stuff. And then build an LLM from the data that you collect. Then quickly speed into 500 BC into ancient Greece. Do the same. And then 100 AD into ancient Rome and do the same. And then 1500 AD in Renaissance Italy and do the same. And create an LLM for each age using the same architecture and compare. You will not dispute the fact that the LLMs you create in each age will be very different and will solve problems very differently. Its thinking will be different. All the way from the kinds of scribal knowledge that we've seen in Egypt, documented on the pyramids, through the Leonardo da Vinci era. There will be very different ways of thinking. Now we get to range. You will also realize that as you move across from the scribal knowledge mechanisms to the current scientific age, you will more or less move more and more from text and words, mostly verbal, deductive, and you will increasingly move into a space that I call the great and sensor space, or the spatial abductive phase. In that process of movement, naturally, the thought process that is encoded in the civilization is shifting as well. And the kinds of problems that are solvable shift. That clearly is what I mean by the fact that it's the civilization that feeds the AI. It's not just data in the abstract or algorithms in the abstract. And that's very important. The challenge, of course, is that in the same way that AI technologies get smarter, we can anticipate a situation where changes in the civilization affect the quality of that technology. And I don't think enough people pay attention. So as we move in terms of how this shift occurs, today, a large proportion of the gains we are seeing are actually coming up by hooking AI to a large range of non-AI tools, more so than from any changes within the technology itself. And that leads me, to my mind, to an extraordinary paradox. It's a paradox that I call the social edge paradox. And that paradox is really simple. If you think about the fact that the AI companies are being forced today to focus on substitution work, human knowledge substitution work, because the big bet of civilization acceleration is not yet ready, then the first thing you have to pay attention to is how they are turning the knowledge industry, the consulting industry, the design industry, etc., into assembly line work, where the human delegates the critical thinking to the machine. But in process of doing so, you are feigning the social interactions within the team, which, remember, as I've tried to explain, is the original source of the civilizational substrate on which the AI grew in the first place. You're turning that substrate within the team. And among the first things that begin to happen is that critical thinking drops. How do we know? We know because Anthropic has done studies that show that whenever someone does a check on Claude, less than 9% of instances that the person verify what Claude says. So what you're seeing is a feigning of that critical thinking layer within the team. In simple terms, we don't solve problems critically together. That's a huge, huge, huge red flag. So social edge paradox. How do we start solving this problem? One way we approach it, for those of you who have been paying attention, is the work that the likes of Jan LeCun have been doing, which is you try and feed AI with a lot of richer media and substrates from the environment. You build large data centers, large sensor networks, and then you pull in this data and you enrich the physical reality of the AI. You enrich the physical reality of the AI using world models and things like that. True. That's certainly one way. But surely, unless we redesign the infrastructure that currently exists, that flow of stimuli is not going to be very effective. In fact, I go further. I argue that we need to move beyond just physical stimuli into immersing the AI systems into social interaction stimuli. And that's what brings me to Africa. It is true, and I'll grant you that, when it comes to the physical infrastructure part, Africa is currently not doing so well. I will grant you that. Less than 1% of compute, data storage capacity, sensors, etc., are on the continent. I'll grant you that. And it has 18% of the world's population, so 1% of compute is really low. But I argue that Africa has immense infrastructure of another kind, the kind that we call social interaction infrastructure. And that is relevant. It's very relevant, and I'll come to that in a moment. The problem is that there's a tension there, and that tension leads to a cognitive trap. Let me explain. So because, as I've tried to explain to you, the AI system, the spectrum of reasoning, is moving from verbal, deductive, words and text through math and puzzles to grace and sensors. So we're moving from more verbal to more spatial and abductive. That is currently the most available AI. And on the African continent, due to weak infrastructure, You start with available AI, which really requires very little infrastructure, but it's heavily verbal. And that is good. That has utility, that has useful outputs. Think of contracts, think of legislative copy editing, think of the clerical outputs. The problem is that for a very long time, Africa has been on this journey of moving away from the colonial, verbal-dominated work forms, the verbal clerical stuff, and more into areas that are in the domain of industrialization, scientific advancement, and the rest. So while the current AI can be very good with textual outputs, what about scientific advancement? What about precision agriculture? What about factory maintenance? What about that kind of stuff? If we're not careful, you lead yourself or you sleepwalk in Africa into a cognitive trap in which the things AI is good at, even without infrastructure, locks you from benefiting from the emerging kind of AI that is much more effective in the logical inductive, the spatial abductive, those kinds of grade and senses play, which is so critical for industrialization. That is the cognitive trap that communities and societies like Africa faces. And it is this cognitive trap that I am committed, working with as many of you as possible, to try and solve. And to do that, we need something we call cross-thinking or transmediation. We need people we call cross-thinkers or transmediaries. Who are these people? They can think across the different silos of machine and human, the informal and the formal. How does that play out in the African context? Very simple. First of all, remember what I said about what Africa is strong at or strong in. Human interactionism, social interactionism, that kind of infrastructure, separate from physical interactionism. Now, the challenge, of course, is that a lot of the people that are really good in grades and senses in Africa are in the informal sectors. I just told you about Brakufi in his auto garage, whipping up his carbide fireworks. They don't have the credentials. They don't have the means to demonstrate how good they are in their carbide fireworks, in their scrap transformative work that they do. And that problem requires a new model of credentialism, a new model of valuing what they bring to the table, and a new model of investing in their enterprises. And this cross-thinking mechanism requires platforms that will not be built by big tech. Why? Because they have to crisscross the private, the public, the educational, the commercial, and the social entrepreneurial. It's a new kind of platform, which the likes of your big tech companies are not designed to do. Let me give you a practical example. Think of a solution that allows a bot to immerse in an auto garage environment as these mechanics and as these tool users debate and argue about engine maintenance and engine diagnosis. It records and annotates, it transcribes, and what is he using that data for? Building video manuals in local languages that can be used to train more of these people, but this time with certification because it's structured and as a format. Think of that kind of possibility. Clearly, big tech is not going to build that, but we absolutely need it. We need to empower people like that. We need to build a new kind of AI thinking. And that kind of AI thinking is very simple. We've had previous technology waves. And most of these technology waves have done one thing. They've concentrated power and wealth in the hands of the few. That's what they've done. We are now on the verge of another technology wave that could accelerate our civilization the fastest way possible. I think that in places like Africa, the civilizational accelerants are people like Brakufi. And I argue that the people who should inherit this new age of AI are the cross-thinkers who can build the kind of platform that I talked to you about, that can empower them, that can recognize them, that can value their work and enable investment. The people in this room can be that club. They can be that community. And you can help us build an AI that is truly social, visionary, and transform the future for the many and not the few.